As you know, the Wilson Center is the official monument to President Woodrow Wilson. We try to bring together policymakers and the world of ideas, students, academics, experts, practitioners. And this is a good example of that, I think, in this room. So we welcome you here. We're very, very happy to have Ambassador Loftus with us, who is going to be speaking to us based on his recent work in and trip to Sudan and looking at some of the innovative tools for local empowerment. This is very much a part of a long-standing project that we've been working on using local and locally owned conflict prevention, conflict resolution, conflict transformation measures. A lot of the work that we do as an Africa program in Burundi, Liberia, Democratic Republic of Congo are based on that. So we're looking very much forward to what Ambassador Loftus has to say. He is the acting coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization. You have his bio before you, so I'm not going to read it all through, and I don't think he wants me to.
Sure I do.
Well, it's too long. It'll take the rest of the afternoon. We'll lose all of our time. Now, our culture here is the ambassador will speak for a while, and of course we want to open it up to exchange with you in the audience. When we do that, we will have microphones to pass around. I will recognize you, identify yourself, make short questions and comments, and we'll try to move through very quickly. Ambassador Loftus.
Thanks very much. I may apologize in advance if I break into a fit of coughing. I'm getting over that cold that seems to be working its way all around Washington, D.C. Naturally ironic that I came back healthy from southern Sudan and immediately get a nasty cold from my wife and daughter. So we'll go on from there. I think, we're all very much aware that the discussion that we're having today is taking place as the referendum on self-determination for southern Sudan is wrapping up. And this referendum has been very much a long time in the making. It's a key part of the 2005 peace agreement that ended the civil war in Sudan. So far, it's been going very well. We are encouraged by the significant voter turnout and believe that it speaks to the credibility of the referendum. It's kind of interesting to note a very interesting human interest story in that South Sudan's oldest ballot caster, a woman by the name of Rebecca Kadi, who at 115 years of age submitted her vote. And in her lifetime, she has seen colonial rule, civil war, and now she hopes for independence. Now, the results will be announced by the end of the month, but so far we're seeing a very high turnout, very few problems, and little, if any, referendum-related violence. I think that's quite a testament to the work that the Sudanese have done to make this happen in the face of what we might call a great deal of skepticism that this thing would ever take place. And I really want to start this by congratulating the Sudanese for making this happen and taking this step forward in implementing the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. The United States and other international actors have been there to support, but the achievement really does belong to them, and that's really one of the themes that I want to hit on today. We, as the United States, can take a great deal of pride in the very active involvement that we've taken in promoting this peace agreement for a number of years. But this afternoon, what I really like to focus on is how our engagement in southern Sudan really is a proof of concept of the idea of a civilian response corps and how we can push our diplomatic engagement away from the capitals, even the southern capital, and have a sustained presence out in the field that will support a country emerging from years of conflict. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience why we're in Sudan. This is a country that's been at war of itself for probably 3/4 of its existence. And except for a 10-year hiatus, the southern part of the country has been embroiled in conflict with major destruction and displacement ever since independence. You've seen over 2 million deaths since 1983 up to 2005, and in that time more than 4 million people displaced from their homes. President Obama has made it clear we have a strong human and national interest in ensuring that the civil war does not resume and that the people of southern Sudan have the chance to exercise their right to self-determination. That commitment to Sudan is reflected in the fact the United States is the largest international donor. We've provided over $10 billion in humanitarian transition, development, peacekeeping, security assistance to Sudan and to eastern Chad since 2005. And although there's clearly a lot of work to do, we may be at a point where we can help the Sudanese break that cycle of violence and contribute to a situation where they will, in fact, determine their own future. Now, to our specific point, it's kind of axiomatic that you can't play if you're not in the game or if you're not in the stadium. And our job in the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization is to put that field in the team. I mean, I like to say that diplomacy is a contact sport. You don't get to mail it in or do it by email. And if you're not there, you have almost no influence. Now, our office, and to get too steeped into the bureaucracy here, but it's very important to note that our job is to augment the work of our embassies and of our regional bureaus at the State Department. We work for, in the case of Southern Sudan, for the Consul General. We work for the Chargé in Khartoum. We work for General Gratian and the Bureau of African Affairs here in Washington. We're very much part of that team. Those of you who might have a military background, I guess the closest analogy would be that we're a supporting command. In other words, we're the guys that help make things happen. We're not the policy lead. So at the request of General Gratian, who's the President's special envoy, he asked us early last year to come in and help support this effort for the referendum on self-determination and to implement the peace plan. And we wanted to get an early start on that, knowing that the referendum was due in January of this year, going on right now, and that there would be a lot to do. So our first step was to get in there and work with his office to create a robust conflict prevention and stabilization program, which had several phases to it. The first phase was really to take what was a very nascent diplomatic platform of only a handful of people in Juba and turn that into a full-fledged consulate general that would support our diplomatic platform. And that meant everything from putting in communications, putting in housing, providing the people that would actually go out and do this so that you would have a platform to be able to operate from. The second part, which is where we are now, is to get people not only to Juba, but to get them out to the state capitals and to get them to the county seats and get them out into the countryside. The first part of that was working very much with observing the preparations for the referendum, cajoling those along, supporting where necessary, and having our teams out right now traveling throughout the country to a tremendous number of polling sites to watch that referendum take place. The key part that now comes next is that traditionally, electoral observation has been you watch the election, you declare it free and fair, you walk away. That's not happening for us now. What we're doing is those teams that are based out there that have been traveling around the country are staying, and we're putting containers for people to live in so that they can stay out and be based in these state capitals, travel around the country, and work with the local authorities, local NGOs, to ensure that we help them identify what are potential flashpoints for violence, what are potential flashpoints for conflict, and help them find ways to resolve that so that the next 6 months as we move forward towards the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, it doesn't get derailed. Now, the key part that what you're doing with all of this is building those personal relationships. As I said, diplomacy is a contact sport. If you're not there, people don't know who you are. They have no trust. You have to build that first. You have to build that by being there. The second thing that our people are doing out there is that they are providing the information that we here in Washington need to inform our policies. And so you have a much clearer idea about what's happening, not just in Juba, but what's happening in Bor or Abwe or any of the other state capitals or even beyond that are out there. And it's helping us to understand the key conflict dynamics, because these are not just people we send out willy-nilly. These are people who we train in looking to figure out what are the conflict dynamics, what are the resiliencies within that society, what are the areas that they can pull on either through a county commissioner or a local NGO or working with the UN to help say, we've got a problem or you've identified a problem, what can we do together to resolve that? And as I mentioned, working very closely with our partners at the United Nations, the African Union, bilateral partners, the United Kingdom. I'm meeting next week with our German counterparts. So there's a lot of interest, and clearly there's so much work that it's not a danger of tripping each over. It's really trying to figure out where we can operate with each other. The other point I'd like to emphasize is that this is not just the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development. Our teams have people from the Commerce Department, from the Justice Department, and even from within the State Department, diplomatic security, and our people from international narcotics and law enforcement to really try and say there are a lot of facets here that we need to address and a lot of people to pull together. And it's not just people that we're providing in the field. General Gration's office, we're probably about half of the people that are there, including planners and conflict specialists, to help really pull this whole thing together so that there is a direct linkage between what happens in the field and what happens in Washington and vice versa. Now, if you can imagine, the sheer logistical challenge of pulling all this together is immense. At 250,000 square miles, southern Sudan is about the size of Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Holland, Germany, and Portugal combined. And there are about 60 miles of paved roads in southern Sudan, and every one of them is in Juba. And believe me, we traveled outside of Juba, and those roads get real bad really, really quick. And I was there when it was easy to travel throughout there. Even basics, hotels, hospitals, clinics, places even to eat, are few and far between. We stayed the one night in a place called Bor, which is the capital of Jonglei State, which is probably about the size of Texas. And there's nothing there. Literally, there's nothing there. There are about a handful of concrete buildings. Everything else is tin shacks and mud and wattle. And the hotel was $100 a night, cash, for a bare concrete room and a cold shower. And it included breakfast and dinner, so I guess you couldn't complain. Now, what we've done is to support my office here, we've put 3 unarmored vehicles. We put 2 armored vehicles out with communications equipment. The security situation can be a little bit dicey in some of the areas. We have a company that is providing drivers and vehicles all over the country, so when we show up, we're able to get around without relying on other people. We've put our entire mobile communication system into place. One of my favorites, we've leased a 19-seat twin propeller aircraft to move our people around and to be able to react to emergencies if necessary. And really kind of as we're doing this, really focusing on the safety and security of all of our people. And this is really one of the first times in a long time that we've done this kind of operation without a lot of military, without any military support, which is what we've had to do for the last number of years when we're really pushing out. We're doing this on our own and to make this happen. Now, all this activity, it's great, it's wonderful, but it's got to have a purpose. What are we actually doing with the people out in the field? And ours, of course, is to support the President's overall policy directive on doing everything possible to prevent a return to civil war. And there are a lot of pieces to that. There's General Gration's diplomacy. There's the development activities of our colleagues at USAID. There's the daily work of our embassy in Khartoum and the Consulate General in Juba and all of the Washington efforts that take place to support that. But our specific efforts are really designed to push our diplomats out of the capitals and even further out into the field. And what they do is they allow our Consulate General to extend its operations that brings U.S. diplomats and local actors much closer together. And it works in 2 fashions. Horizontal, in the sense that if trouble emerges, there are county commissioners, state governors, and others actually have our people's telephone numbers on their speed dials. And they call up and they ask for advice and help, and I'll give a couple of examples. And on the other hand, it allows our people to be able to identify problems in the field that they can take to our consulate in Juba or our embassy in Khartoum and say, you need to go back to Washington or you need to go to national authorities to take some action to help head this problem off. Now, as I mentioned, our first task was to do the monitoring for the referendum. And that's really coming to a close, and as I said, the results will be announced, and others will be making their analysis of whether this was a free and fair, credible referendum. And I'm certainly not in a position right now to make that kind of response. But let me talk about some examples of what our people are doing and have done in the field. Directly related to the referendum, there are several cases where local referendum officials complained to our people that they weren't getting the materials. They weren't getting the registration materials. They weren't getting the information materials. They were trying to get through to Juba. They were trying to get through to Khartoum, and nothing was happening. Just logistics, people were ignored. They didn't get the message. And our folks would then get a hold of our consulate general, who would then go into the referendum commission, and lo and behold, the materials would show up. It's a relatively simple thing, but it's the kind of thing that if it doesn't happen, the referendum fails. And then you do have the risk of return to civil war. Something one of the more interesting ones in my mind was that one of our stabilization team members who's just returned was in a dialogue with some people, and there were two conflicting groups, two different tribes who were not able to come together. It was a Greater Upper Nile Peace Initiative, which is a community-based organization in Jonglei State, off on the southeast. And they were trying to bring these two tribes together, the Bordinka and the Murle. But the two leaders, the leaders of the tribes, could not agree. They didn't trust each other. They didn't trust that the safety of their people could be guaranteed, and they couldn't figure out a way to get them together because neither one was willing to travel to the other's territory, and they had no neutral place to meet. And they really, the local leaders, the GUMPI, the Greater Upper Nile Peace Initiative, really didn't have the contacts with the government to be able to make anything happen. So they came to us, and our member went to the governor of the state and to talk to him about what the problem was. And the governor then said, all right, I'll go meet with them. And he went, got them together. He brokered an agreement that set up the location of the tribe and then allowed them to go forward. And they're continuing on with their discussions now and simply finding a way to resolve those differences between those two tribes. In another instance, sometimes what you do is simple as playing mailman. There was a governor of a southern state who needed to deliver a letter to the presidency in the north about grievances between his people and those of the neighboring state, which was in the northern part of the country, that really were threatening to spiral out of control. And he wanted to inform Juba of his intent to send the letter, and he needed to do this rather quickly because tensions were rising. And we essentially played mailman. I mean, these guys were not able to talk to each other. We got there. The two governors got together. They were able to start this dialogue and just calm things down. And then finally, I want to talk about a case that predates the arrival of the Civilian Response Corps, but really illustrates that if you expand your reach into more parts of the country, there are things that you can do to really be helpful. In 2009, Jonglei State was probably the most violent place in all of southern Sudan. I mean, there were killings by the hundreds, and there were massacres that were taking place that had started off as simple cattle raids that had spun up out of control where hundreds of people were dying. And you would have basically triangular raids. One group would raid this group, they would go over raid here, this group would come down here, and you get it wasn't even bilateral, you had a number of different pieces going together. And the local county commissioner obviously knew what was going on, and he had a solution, but he had no money, he had no wherewithal to do it. So he came to the consulate and said, look, what I know is that most of this is being done by young men who have no jobs, have no future. And what I need to do is give them something to do, and I need to use that to foster a reconciliation process. So USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives paid for just a group of small hand brick-making machines and some boats. So you put the young men to work building bricks and getting a ferry service across the river and rebuilding. And it wasn't that they rebuilt their own village. They had to go over and rebuild the village structures in the villages that they had attacked. And then that village, those young men had to go over to the other village that they attacked, and so you got this nice little circle going. And not only did you get everything reconstructed, you get young men with some skills. They now have jobs in terms of constructing, and they've had this start of a reconciliation process that will help break that cycle of violence. These are things that I'm hoping and expecting that we'll be able to do more of when we have more people out in the field to identify some rather effective but low-cost ways of doing this. The thing to remember, the thing I want to emphasize about all of this is not that we are in the lead to do this. We are there as a catalyst, we're there as a facilitator, we're there as an honest broker to help, in this case, the Sudanese, the southern Sudanese, identify and carry out their own peace-building activities at a local level. And the idea of our contribution in this particular case is to ensure that what we're doing at the local level feeds in to ensure that you don't have things spinning up out of control that then impact into a larger, ignite a larger war, for example. Let me just kind of move on a little bit here and just say that, we were able to do, I have to put in a plug for our organization because I really like it a lot. We're able to do this because we're not just a tactical tool. We are a strategic tool. We have been part of this, not just putting people in the field, but designing the whole concept of what we do, how we operate in the field, and supporting our entire diplomatic effort, from supporting NSC staff meetings, doing the contingency planning, bringing it all together, to figuring out how do you actually support somebody and feed somebody in a place like Abwell. How do you do this? We are the binding agent, I would say, that pulls together USAID, the Department of Defense, our own Population, Refugee, and Migration Bureau, International Narcotics and Labor, Africa Bureau, all of that coming together through us. And as I mentioned before, and do want to emphasize, our key role is supporting our chief of mission out in the field. It's interesting to note that the people who came up with this idea of putting our people out in the field were members of our staff who had served in Afghanistan and had developed the whole concept of the Provincial Reconstruction Team. Not that these are PRTs, but the lessons that we garnered from that experience we're able to take and shape our engagement into in southern Sudan based on what we had learned there. And this is part of what our organization does as well, is to really try and be a learning organization, figuring out what works, pulling it in from other people's experience as well as our own, and then as we take on new missions and continue with current missions, constantly refining that. Let me pull this back to Sudan and quote the president. Foreign Service officers never go wrong quoting the president, but so he recently pointed out that not every generation is given the chance to turn the page on the past and write a new chapter in history. And those who are casting a vote in this referendum will be remembered by history, and they will also have a steady partner in the United States. And I think for our part, we're certainly planning on being there easily through July, and I suspect much longer than that, to help continue this process of working on preventing a return to conflict. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. And I'd like to finish by simply, again, really acknowledging and congratulating the people of Sudan for this very tremendous and historic accomplishment that they're going through right now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have a good 20 minutes to devote to questions and answers. As I said, raise your hand. I'll recognize you. The first one I see here. Second one there. Right down here, Melody. Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Alex Stark with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. First, Ambassador Loftus, I wanted to thank you for your wonderful presentation and for your work. My organization has been really excited to see the work that SCRS and the Civilian Response Corps has been doing. So thank you for that. We're a little concerned, though, looking at the congressional appropriations process, seeing the cuts that were made for SCRS in the CR recently and looking into the future. And we were wondering specifically how SCRS is planning to respond to that and adjusting plans to make sure that you can continue this really great work on the ground. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. Let's take 2 or 3 questions at once, and we can put them together. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Richard Parkins, and I'm with the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of Sudan. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your comments, and I commend the work that you're doing there. You didn't mention anything about the role of churches in Sudan, and the 2 largest civil institutions in southern Sudan would be the Episcopal Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And I think they've historically played an important role in the area of reconciliation. In fact, I know the Episcopal Archbishop has been actively involved in working in several highly contentious and difficult areas. And as you well know, the churches are ubiquitous in Sudan. They're everywhere. Often where there is nothing else, there's the presence of a church. And I'm just wondering if that resource is a part of the planning that you're doing, because I think it's a resource that could be extremely valuable in terms of peace building and reconciliation.
Let's take those two. A lot of meat there, and then we'll go on.
Okay. The budget cuts, the reality, believe it or not, is that we're doing fairly well on the budget. And the reason I say that is because we asked for and got a budget that was too large in the beginning, and that we were not able to spend. And one of the worst things you can do in Washington is not spend the budget that you've got. Right now, based on what we have from the continuing resolution and looking at ahead to the budget request for 2012, I'm actually fairly confident that we'll be able to continue our operations and to continue to build both the Civilian Response Corps and our capabilities in Washington. The reality also is that we will not get a contingency budget. Most government organizations will get them, which is a difficulty because we are a contingency operation and we cannot, as much as we'd like to, fully predict the future and say that there will be a crisis in such and such a country that we'll have to respond to. On the other hand, I kind of look at this as a tool that is becoming increasingly valuable for the United States government as a whole and is being recognized as that. And we will continue to operate in areas where the President and the Secretary determine that we need to be, and we will find ways to continue our operations. I'll let me put it that. In terms of looking at the role of churches, I think one of the key points for having our people in the field the way that we're doing this is to be able to make those connections with church groups, with civil society, with local government officials, whoever is out there in a position to help the peace process forward and to identify areas where there are potential flashpoints, conflict. Certainly, one of the things we look at when we do our conflict assessment is looking at the resiliencies within a society. What are those factors that you can call on within a country or within a society that will help either prevent something from happening, head it off, or once something is underway, who can you call on to help do that? We've got 22 people in the country. That's not enough. And it's not we are not the first ones responsible for making things happen in Sudan. The Sudanese are. So for us, it's really looking for partners like the churches, like NGOs, like tribal, whomever it is. Those are the people that we reach out with and see where is it that we can help them achieve their goals. So the churches are very much part of that calculation.
Okay, thank you. All right, a couple of more questions. Okay, one right down here. Yeah. Nope. Okay.
I'm Karen Dickman with the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. Can you elaborate a little bit on the role China has had in Sudan in the recent years and what role it might project after the referendum?
Okay, and a second question right behind, and then behind again. We've got a heavy left side here.
Yes, we do.
Let's be balanced.
Two brain spheres. I'm Dan Whitman, formerly of the Africa Bureau at State and now with American University. This is intended as a softball question. It may not sound as such. There is a very influential think tank in Washington, not the Cato Institute, but another one, that says that the referendum in southern Sudan is a contrivance of the U.S. government, is an intent to create a puppet state in that area, and undermines the normal sovereignty that should normally be the recognized process. This is a departure from the AU policy of not having countries split up. Your answer to that, please. Thanks very much.
Okay. And one last question right behind there, yes.
Hi.
Claudia.
How are you?
Good.
I wanted you to explain. You said you try to beef up the people in country and some back here. How do you recruit some of the civilians who are working with you?
Okay. Thank you.
All right, let me start with those three. China. Actually, I'm going to dodge that question for the most part. No, seriously, it's we within my organization, we don't really deal very much with the Chinese. At least we haven't so far, and certainly not in Sudan. And it's one of those questions where, particularly with the Secretary making a major speech on U.S.-China relations today, I'm not qualified enough to make an answer that I would feel comfortable with. So I apologize, but I'm a coward on those. Is the referendum a contrivance by the United States, and is it a departure from the AU? Only if one assumes that 50 years of civil war in southern Sudan is a contrivance of the United States, and that the Southerners have no idea of what their own interests and desires are. To my mind, it's quite clear that people who have been willing to undergo the sacrifices that they've been willing to undergo for these many years certainly know their mind pretty well, and that they came to a comprehensive peace agreement in 2005 that called for a referendum. The idea that the United States would be able to manipulate that many people to vote that way is rather flattering but incredibly unrealistic. So, I mean, I treat that for what it's worth. In terms of the AU policy, the African Union is looking at this. They have had a longstanding policy within the African Union, and before that the Organization of African Unity, on not changing borders. But this is not the first time. I mean, we've already had Ethiopia and Eritrea split, so it's up to the African Union to decide whether this is the part of a trend or this is the last time they support this. It really is their choice, not ours. How do we recruit? There are I hope a lot of potential recruits here. There are two parts to the Civilian Response Corps, and the main point is that all of them are U.S. government employees. The active component, we have about 140 right now. The funding will let us take that to 200, and we want to go beyond that. But these are people from the State Department, USAID, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and Department of Agriculture. And am I missing anybody? Commerce. Thank you. My gosh, Commerce, yeah. Who sign up. We pay for their salaries, and they are on 20 or 48-hour call to go wherever we ask them to go to undertake these kind of activities. It's a very diverse group of people, a very dedicated group of people. They have to go through 8 weeks of training, generic training before they go, plus the specific training otherwise. The other part of the Civilian Response Corps is what we call the standby component. They're also full-time government employees, but they have their day jobs in their home agencies, and that includes all the ones I listed, plus Energy has just joined us, and I think Transportation will finalize their participation, I hope, in the next couple of weeks. And they volunteer to go out to be part of these lessons, these teams. And so when we're sending people out, they come from both. We rely primarily and first on the active component because they are our people. That's their first job. But the standby people have also done a very strong contribution as well. And then we also pull on people who are part of what we call our corporate staff, people who work here in Washington who take part of that. We also pull on retirees from the Foreign Service. That's all by legislation that we're allowed to do right now. And we're looking at ways in which we can pull other people from outside the government, but that, quite frankly, is very much in the formative stage at the moment. You interested in signing up? Because I know we need some good public diplomacy officers.
Okay, we've got one question way in the back there.
Dave Ottaway, I'm a senior scholar here. I'm curious if, what you've seen in your trip down there about what the southern government, which has its own degree of local autonomy, has been doing with the oil money revenues that it gets, a half of the total, in terms of beginning to build infrastructure of a state or any kind of medical services or the first mile beyond the 60 miles outside of Cuba, the road you spoke of. What do you see them doing other than buying tanks from Ukraine to get ready for their own independence?
Okay, and the second question right here.
Hi. My name's Helen, and my question is about, so when your people go out in the field and they're assessing conflicts, what are the local traditional ways of building peace? If you could speak on that.
Let me take the prerogative of chair and add a question of my own, Bob, if you don't mind. I was fascinated to hear you say that you have no military support in this. I assume you mean financial as well as logistic in terms of your deployment. Is this purpose? What's the policy behind this? Is this connected to the diplomacy and development of the famous 3Ds, part of the vision that we see in the QDDR, or is this just worked out that way?
Okay. In terms of the oil money, I think the people who are better able to talk to this are the folks from the Special Envoy's office or from the Africa Bureau. But let me just say that the things that I saw down there and what I heard from the Sudanese, or the South Sudanese right now, is one, they complain about not getting what they think they're owed in terms of their share of the oil revenue. So that's been an ongoing issue, and it's one of the things that will still be worked on is the whole question of how they share those oil revenues. My understanding is that a large part of what they have has been spent on the military right now, and I think that's been driven in large part by hedging their bets on a fear of return to war. Whether they will be able to shift that anytime soon, I don't know. But for a group of people who have spent most of their life in conflict, I think that's been waiting to see what happens with this. Well, then we'll see where the shift in the funds go. Certainly it's something that we and a lot of other people, not just the United States, but the UN and other international donors are talking to them about how to spend their money and even how to reform. Eventually we'll be in a position to talk to them about how to reform their military so that it's appropriate to their needs. Local ways of building peace. A lot of it is, ways that aren't actually all that different from what you would expect to see elsewhere. Getting the right people together to talk, working on restitution, if you will. I mean, the things that we're supporting are in many ways traditional local-led peace-building activities. What the commissioner wanted to do in Jonglei, for example, of getting the people together to go back and rebuild, that was a local initiative. Coming to us and asking to get help in getting these two groups together. Again, these are local initiatives, so that's not. I don't really see anything different. I mean, there might be something very novel, in which I'm not an expert on Sudan, so if there's something very novel, I'm not aware of it. But these are not techniques that are necessarily unique to any part of the world. Why no military? Let me emphasize, actually, the three largest deployments that my office is involved in are Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Sudan. And they run the gamut. I mean, in Afghanistan, we are heavily integrated, obviously, with the military across the board in all of our activities there. In Kyrgyzstan, it's primarily a civilian-led in office, but there is some involvement from the Manas Transit Center, and so we work with them on some of the things that we're doing there. In Sudan, it's been primarily designed as a civilian-led effort, and the idea is that there are a lot of areas in the world where it makes better sense to use civilians, diplomats, aid experts, development experts, and others to do this kind of work, because quite frankly, in many ways, we've relied too heavily on our military and in particular the military reserves to take on these roles, and it really is our responsibility to make that happen. So it's not it is by no means an anti-military activity. It just really is that we look at this as being primarily our responsibility and our responsibility to get it done.
Okay, I think we have time for one more round of questions. So I see one hand here, one hand there, and one hand in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Loftus. First, just I want to commend you and your team. We at Inclusive Security have been working with your team who reached out to us to actually engage with women directly in Sudan. As you know, women have the highest infant and maternal mortality rate in the world, and are often a population that people don't quite know how to reach out to or how to find. So first is just to commend you and your staff for being very proactive on that. The second is a question that's not directly related, which is about coordination with other organizations that are working in Sudan. For instance, Catholic Relief Services has been doing a lot with early warning systems, which is directly related to the work that SCRS is doing. So the question is, kind of what is your policy and perspective on the need for and how you are engaging with other organizations? And the reason I ask that is because the review of the multi-donor trust fund basket that is basically managed by the World Bank, one of the biggest criticisms is the lack of coordination between donors and organizations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. How does your team in South Sudan work with a team from other country but China? And also that it's possible the African in the future will absorb the Department State operation. Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question? Who will absorb?
Second part of the question.
Yeah.
Repeat it.
Africa Bureau?
No, Africa.
AFRICOM. Oh,
Yeah.
AFRICOM.
Oh, AFRICOM.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
I missed that too.
It is possible not just straight Department Defense operation. Could it also absorb some Department State operation?
Right.
And yes, right in the middle there. Oh, no, I've confused them, so they both get a question. It's okay. My fault.
Amir Osman, I'm with Save Darfur Coalition. We have heard many statements about the possibility of South Sudan becoming a failed state. From what you have seen on the ground, what would be your reaction to this statement? And do you know if the administration is prepared to support the government of South Sudan? Second question, quickly. I assume that your office is not working on Darfur. If asked by Immigration to do similar work in Darfur after the referendum, are you prepared to do that? Do you have the capacity?
Yeah, just pass.
Hi, my name's Katie, and I'm a student here, and I just wanted to thank you for speaking today. My question is, with success of the referendum, there have been talks of North Sudan implementing the Sharia law, which could lead to potential human rights violations, among other things. And I'm just wondering what if this is being looked at, or if that's part of your policy.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, coordination with other organizations. As I mentioned earlier, with the small group of people that we have, we're not going to be able to do all of this stuff on our own. I mean, it very much takes a group effort to make all this happen. Our Consulate General in Juba works very closely with the United Nations. There's a very large United Nations presence there, and in many of these situations, it's the UN who pull all of the various pieces together to the extent that they can. Everywhere that I've been involved, they take on that role through the resident coordinator, usually UNDP. In this case, it's actually a peacekeeping operation that has the lead in that, and we take part in all of those conversations. As a policy, we encourage that to the extent we can. I also have to, it's like herding cats sometimes, though. I mean, getting everybody with different funding streams and different mandates to pull together, and sometimes the best coordination you can get is simply not falling all over each other. But certainly, in working with the British, for example, their stabilization unit, which is our counterpart, they have 3 people there. And we have an informal arrangement. They have one in Juba, and they've put 2 people out at the state level, and they're operating in states where we are not. And we're getting information from them and working with them on that. The Germans are getting ready to send some people out. They're coming in to see us next week to talk about what they're doing. But if you're really going to talk about effective coordination, in my mind, it has to take place in the field. It's getting the people who are there, the local consulates, the local NGOs, the UN. They're the ones. You can dictate this from Washington or New York or Geneva, but if it doesn't happen on the ground, it's not going to happen. And conversely, even if Washington and Geneva and New York can't get along, you can still make it happen if you're out in the field. So I think that's there. Other teams, right now, other than the British and the UN, there isn't anybody else out there. There are a lot of, in terms of governments, there are a lot of NGOs out there. There are a lot of other people out there, and as I mentioned, we do try to work as much as we can with them. I'm not quite sure I understood the question about AFRICOM, but we are not being taken over by the U.S. Africa Command. They have a very small presence in southern Sudan. It's primarily liaison work. Because this is not an independent country yet, we have to wait till the results of the referendum and the implementation of the peace plan, that it would be inappropriate for them to be working with them. And there's a very clear division of responsibilities between what the military does and what the State Department does, what USAID does. We work together as a team, but they're not taking over. And I say that as partly as one of the people who helped set up the Africa Command, so I'm pretty familiar with their operations. Question of a failed state. I think one of the things that I think, from the level of investment that the United States has made in Sudan as a whole and in southern Sudan, I would point out that AID, for example, is back in the business of building roads, and one of the ones that they're building is in southern Sudan in cooperation with the Japanese, who are building a dam, or excuse me, a bridge across the Nile River at Juba. It's our intent, and I think the president on down, is make it quite clear that we're there to work with the Sudanese, whether it's as part of a unified state or as part of a newly independent country. We're there to work with them. At the end of the day, though, it's the responsibility of the people of southern Sudan and their leaders to take the necessary steps to put together a government that's representative, to build that foundation for a viable country to be born. I mean, they certainly have the resources to do it, and they've got a lot of goodwill from a lot of people. But ultimately, that responsibility belongs to them, with the help from us and others. In Darfur, I think you may have seen the announcement that Ambassador Dane Smith has been appointed as the senior advisor for Darfur, to working with General Gratian. He has a staff member right now who is from our office, and we will look at whatever is requested of us by the leadership, by the President, or by the Secretary of State, in terms of assisting with that Darfur process. Beyond that, I'm not really in a position to say, but we're ready to take on whatever we're asked to do. Sharia law. I think, quite frankly, at this point, it's premature and I'm not really the person to comment on what will be the form of the new government if there is a split in Sudan, and what will be the aftermath. There's a lot of different calculations as to what would happen there and how people in the North would react.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Loftus. We appreciate your openness, your frankness, and when you couldn't respond, we appreciate that too. It's good that you're very open about it. Join me in thanking the Ambassador for...
Sure. And by the way, how many political science majors are there here? All right, just to let you know, for 4 years I listened to my mother say, "What are you going to do with a political science degree?" 30 years. It actually is useful.
Very good.